Almost every single farm that was expropriated under the ANC government has failed thus far. The government of South Africa has expropriated nearly 4 million hectares of arable farmland and spent at least $5 billion in taxpayer money to expropriate white-owned property and give it to black people over the last 30 years. Yet, after 30 years and massive government spending on grants for black farmers, more than 90% of those farms have failed so dismally that they have been reduced to dormant land today. It is important to note that this video is about the expropriation of farms under the previous expropriation bill that was with compensation. It is just so important to note that even with compensation, the expropriation paid the farmers as little as 10% of fair market value for their property. This subject will be discussed in tomorrow's video. Today's video is about the success rate of these expropriated farms. One of the most obvious examples that come to mind is Zebediela citrus estate, a 3,000 hectare citrus farm that was once the biggest citrus plantation in the southern hemisphere. When it was expropriated in 2003, it was valued at $30 million and produced over 3 million export quality oranges per annum. The new owners of Zebediela even received a $30 million government grant, but despite this, the farm went bankrupt in 2023. At the final liquidation of the farm, the liquidators could not even recover 1/100th of its original value, as the buildings were decimated into ruin, and not even 100 of the original 300 or 3,000 hectares of citrus plantations were left. The new owners chopped it all down for firewood. Good day, dear friends, this is Willem Petzer speaking. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more informative videos speaking about topics in our interests. We are also welcoming you to join our WhatsApp groups to keep you informed of the work the Willem Petzer group is doing by just sending your name and surname to the Willem Petzer group number as displayed on the screen on WhatsApp. Since the start of South Africa's formal land clearance process in 1996, which shortly followed the ANC's takeover of 1994, $5 billion in taxpayers' money has been spent on buying properties from white farmers and redistributing, as they put it, to black beneficiaries. Now, firstly, it must be said that the entire concept of redistributing property in this country is fundamentally flawed, since white people did not steal land from black people as leftist propagandists would have you believe since before the end of apartheid in 1994. While of course there were isolated incidents of property being acquired unjustly in the past, this is the case with every society in the world, and it always has been. South Africa is no exception. As a rule, white people in South Africa historically settled land peacefully, mostly in unlivable areas where it was needed for modern technology to even survive, or engaged in free and fair trade with local populace. But of course, in light of the narrative being pushed by the ruling party and the mandate with which they have always held the government power, they really had no choice but to initiate this claims process once they took office. Since then, nearly 4 million hectares of this farmland has been bought and redistributed by the government, and tragically, the overwhelming majority of these farms transferred to black ownership became completely unproductive. In 2010, the Ministry of Agriculture admitted that more than 90% of redistributed farms that had previously been productive commercial farms have become unproductive. A 2016 report by the Financial and Fiscal Commission confirmed that the vast majority of land reformed farms operate well below their agricultural potential. The report, which surveyed farms across 3 South African provinces, noted an overall decrease of 79% in crop production since the land was transferred to black ownership. Accompanying this decline in production was an 84% decline in jobs. More recently, a 2022 study of 529 redistributed farms found that 75% of them were laying dormant. Another striking example of failed land reform initiative in South Africa is the Dawn Valley Farm near Izopo in KwaZulu-Natal province, which has received significant media attention due to the fact that it was such an utter failure. This 2,100 hectare vegetable farm was purchased by the government for just over $1 million in 2008. Yet, from that time until today, there has been virtually no crop cultivation on what is some of the most fertile agricultural land in this country. The project was supposed to be part of the government's broader efforts to redistribute land to black South Africans to farm commercially, but it has ended up being an absolute disaster. This is a Google Earth image of Dawn Valley Farm before it was purchased by the government in 2008, and this is what the same farm looks like now. The new landowners have struggled with modern farming techniques, and they have exhibited a complete inability to farm the land profitably. Instead of thriving economically, the area has also seen increasing unemployment and poverty. As such, many of the beneficiaries of land reform have consequently again sold their land to local white farmers or large agricultural corporations, as they were unable to make a decent living from it, despite these farms being very large and very productive before they got them. Another example that has recently made headlines is the Skeerpoort megafarm near Brits in the Northwest Province, which had been purchased by the government in 2019 as part of its land reform project. This massive, formerly productive vegetable farm is now in complete disarray, with virtually no productive economic activity going on.
A 115-year-old Sina Mudise was born on this particular farming plot. Despite her parents having worked on it for decades, her and her family were eventually kicked out of the farm. She described the circumstances of living on this farm for her family. The families attained the 55 farms through the extension of the Security of Tenure Act in the 1990s. They want committees heading the Communal Land Association to be sacked for allocating CPA funds worth over 25 million to themselves.
We actually want to achieve the goals of removing this office out of office.
This is after almost $2 million invested into the project was completely mismanaged by the so-called Communal Property Association to whom the land had been given. These are but two out of dozens of examples of how formerly productive and very rich farms purchased from white owners have been turned into complete and utter disasters after being given to black owners in the name of transformation and black economic empowerment. The Transvaal Agricultural Union is one organization that has always been vocal about the shortcomings of South Africa's land reform initiative. In 2016, the TAU highlighted that many land reform projects have failed to generate employment or to improve the livelihoods of beneficiaries. The report noted that most of the land reform projects have not led to increased agricultural productivity or job creation. In fact, the state of many of these formerly successful commercial farms is so bad that many beneficiaries even remain dependent on social grants despite owning hectares and thousands of hectares of some of the best farmland in the country. The underutilization of redistributed land has had tremendously negative implications for all South Africans. Unproductive land fails to contribute to economic growth, job creation, and poverty alleviation, undermining the very objectives that the land reform supposedly seeks to achieve. But in addition to the underutilization of land, the entire land reform project by itself is starred by massive corruption scandals. Ultimately, the project not only threatens property rights but also jeopardizes the nation's economic stability and social cohesion. But the question is, of course, to what should this massive failure of black farming enterprises South Africa be attributed? Well, firstly, it must be said that the reality is that the current land reform initiatives are deeply rooted in ideologies that prioritize state control over private property rights. It is well known that the government bases their land reform project within socialist or communist ideological frameworks, which historically have always led to economic decline. And in this regard, Zimbabwe is of course a well-known example for all of us to see, as the country that was once known as the breadbasket of Africa has experienced food shortages ever since they expropriated the farmland from white farmers there. Furthermore, and this simply cannot be emphasized enough, the push for expropriation without compensation is not really about rectifying past injustices. It is ultimately about advancing a political agenda that fundamentally undermines the principles of a free market economy and free enterprise. Farms end up in the hands of black people who not only lack the ability to farm economically or commercially, but also in fact lacked any desire to do so. The people to whom these farms are awarded are more often than not simply connected to politicians driving the land reform agenda. It is about getting your hands on other people's property, other people's wealth, and not really about claiming back any historical property rights as is so often claimed. In fact, if you were to drive through the historical homelands of the black tribes in South Africa, the former Bantustans as they were called, you will see hundreds of thousands of hectares of underutilized or even completely unutilized land. If the land reform project was really about providing opportunities for black people in the agricultural industry, then why not invest into those areas? Why not create infrastructure there and utilize the land? Why not educate people in the science of agriculture? Why would you spend millions and millions of dollars like the government does to turn productive privately owned farms into what almost always end up becoming unproductive government property? The only logical explanation for this is that our government is like an incompetent yet power-hungry tyrant who simply cannot stand to watch private enterprise, especially white private enterprise, succeed in the midst of their own innumerable failures. The reality is that while agriculture is so fundamentally part of the Afrikaner or Boer people, that the very name by which our people are known literally translates into farmer into English. Farming is in our blood, and we have always been successful in doing this for many generations. The same simply cannot be said of other peoples within this country, as they have never had a culture of commercial agriculture, a handful of exceptions notwithstanding. The argument commonly made is that black farmers do not receive sufficient support from the government, which is also nonsense because they are aided a lot more than the vast majority of white farmers has ever been in the history of this country. In fact, millions of dollars have been spent not only on the training of black farmers, but also providing them with state-of-the-art infrastructure and equipment. Ultimately, the idea that one would be able to achieve the same outcome with two different groups of people is based in the false ideology of egalitarianism, which has no basis in reality itself. At the end of the day, no one except for a small group of elitists with political connections has benefited from the failed land reform program project that has now already been unsuccessfully implemented by the government for 3 decades. If anything, it only serves to deter both domestic and foreign investment and leads to a capital flight, job losses, and even more poverty through a decrease in economic growth by virtue of a decline in production. In fact, even leftist scholars such as Mandla Mubekwa and Victor H. Mlambo from the University of Zululand has been forced to admit in recent publications, and I'm quoting them verbatim here, despite the decades of land reform in the post-apartheid era, poverty, land inequality, and land unproductivity continue to increase. Yet, the increase in power under ANC rule and the decline in economic activities and opportunities, especially in rural agricultural areas, is evident for all to see. But even apart from the economic factors, the very idea that property ownership itself is a result of oppression is a classic Marxist tactic aimed at destroying the entrepreneurial spirit in the name of equality. The entire land reform policy of the government is based on a false narrative according to which whites are the perpetual oppressors and blacks are the perpetually oppressed, which only exacerbates social and racial tensions in this country. No so-called economic empowerment or land reform project will ever change this, because it is based on an imaginary, make-believe world where any and every failure you experience and any challenges that come across your path is never something for which you can ever take any personal responsibility, but is always to be blamed on somebody else. Once you deviate from free market principles and voluntary exchange, basic economic principles the ANC government seems to really despise, you run into immense problems and you end up oppressing everyone. Not just a particular group, by the way, not just white people, but everyone. Both the so-called haves and the have-nots. Everyone in this part of the world, not only in South Africa, but also in our neighboring countries, are dependent upon food production of the successful commercial farmers of South Africa. Why not support these people? Why not try to provide the most ideal circumstances for one of the key industries of the South African economy to flourish? Because ultimately the racialized Marxist ideology that drives the ruling party in this country, and sadly drives their supporter base who keeps voting them into power, has blinded these people to the destruction and decline caused by their own asinine policies. We shall continue to bring analysis of topics in your interest, so be sure to subscribe and be sure to join our WhatsApp group. Just your name and surname to the Willem Petzer group WhatsApp number on the screen. Goodbye and God bless.